"Follow my lead," the giant mountain man told his bride, and she had no choice. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and a soft breeze brushed her face, lifting stray strands of hair from her eyes. She had always loved the mountains, even though they scared most people. There was something wild and pure about them, something that made her feel alive in a way that the small town she had grown up in never could. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the weight pressing against her shoulders. She had packed lightly, just a few essentials, water, a map, and some snacks, but even so, the path ahead seemed endless. The trail wound upward, cutting through dense forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, casting long, shifting shadows. She paused for a moment to take it all in, letting the quiet of the wilderness wash over her. There was a strange thrill in knowing she was alone, yet she felt no fear, only anticipation. For hours she walked, her boots crunching against the gravel and fallen leaves. She stopped occasionally to admire the view, rolling hills, steep cliffs, and narrow valleys stretching into the distance. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became, and the harder her lungs worked. Sweat dampened her hair and forehead, but she welcomed the effort. Every step felt like a small victory. She was determined to reach the hidden lake she had read about, a secluded spot far beyond where casual hikers ever ventured. As the morning passed into early afternoon, she noticed the sky beginning to change. Clouds gathered over the peaks, dark and heavy, threatening rain. She hesitated, unsure whether to continue or turn back. She was confident in her abilities, yet she could not ignore the warning signs. Still, curiosity pushed her forward. The thought of discovering the lake, of seeing it untouched and hidden in the mountains, made her heart race. It was then, in a narrow clearing surrounded by towering pines, that she first noticed him. At first, she thought he was a shadow, a trick of the light. But as she blinked and focused, she saw a figure standing near the edge of the path. He was enormous, taller than any man she had ever seen, with broad shoulders and thick, calloused hands. His clothes were simple and practical, made for life in the wilderness. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, blending with the forest around him, and his eyes were sharp, observing her every move. She froze, unsure how to react. Her heart pounded in her chest. The man said nothing at first, simply watching her as she stood there, small and vulnerable on the trail. There was a presence about him that made the air seem heavier, as if the mountains themselves had sent him to guard this place. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, but her voice caught in her throat. Finally, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. His voice was low, deep, and carried a weight that made her take notice. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet warning, yet it carried authority. She swallowed nervously, trying to appear brave. I know the trail," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've hiked before." He studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing, as if he could see every intention behind her words. Then he shook his head slowly. "This part of the mountain is dangerous. You won't make it alone." She felt a mixture of defiance and fear. She had always prided herself on being independent, capable of handling challenges on her own. Yet something about this man made her doubt her confidence. There was no arrogance in his stance, no unnecessary display of power. He simply stood there, solid and unmovable, and in that stillness she felt the truth of his words. I can manage," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. The man stepped closer, his presence imposing yet not threatening. "If you want to survive, you follow my lead," he said simply. There was no room for argument, no negotiation. It was not a command shouted in anger, but a statement of fact, as natural as the trees around them. She hesitated, the pride she had clung to for so long warring with the undeniable reality before her. The mountains were unforgiving, and she was alone, lost and unprepared. Every instinct in her body screamed that she should trust him, that this giant of a man, mysterious as he was, might be her only chance. Finally, she nodded, a small, hesitant gesture that carried enormous weight. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll follow." He gave a subtle nod in response, not a smile, not a word of praise, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and began walking down a faint, almost invisible trail that led deeper into the forest. She followed, her steps careful, trying to match his pace without faltering. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip her at every step. She could feel the muscles in her legs burning with effort, yet she kept going. As they walked, she noticed the way he moved, steady, deliberate, completely attuned to the environment. Every step was calculated, every branch pushed aside or avoided with ease. She realized she had been moving through the forest blindly, taking for granted the small details that made survival possible. Watching him, she learned without him speaking, a lesson in patience, observation, and respect for the mountains. Hours passed, and the clouds overhead grew darker. Rain began to fall lightly, first as drops that tickled her face, then as a steady drizzle that soaked her clothes and chilled her to the bone. The trail became slippery and treacherous. She slipped once and nearly fell, but he caught her arm with surprising strength, steadying her without a word. She looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his grip despite his immense size. "You have to watch your step," he said quietly, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. She nodded, embarrassed but also grateful. The fear that had lingered at the edge of her mind began to shift into something else: trust. Not blind trust, but a cautious reliance on his knowledge and skill. She began to realize that following him was not surrender, it was survival. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the outside world faded. There was no distant road, no village noise, only the soft patter of rain on leaves and the crunch of their footsteps. She started to notice small things she had never paid attention to before. The smell of damp moss, the way the trees swayed in the wind, the occasional call of a bird warning of nearby danger. It was as if the mountains themselves were alive, and he knew their language. Occasionally he would stop and point out a subtle sign, a broken branch, an animal track, a hidden stream. Each time he would explain briefly, his voice calm and measured. She listened intently, absorbing every detail. She began to feel a shift inside herself, a growing respect for the wilderness and the man who commanded it so effortlessly. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing with a narrow stream running through it. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the soft light filtering through the clouds made the forest feel almost magical. He gestured toward a flat, dry area beside the stream. "We'll rest here for a while," he said. She nodded, grateful for the pause, though her body ached from the hike. As she sat on a large rock, she finally allowed herself to study him more closely. His face was weathered, with lines carved by years of exposure to sun, wind, and hardship. Yet there was a calmness in his expression, a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. She wondered about his life, why he chose to live alone in the mountains, how he had learned to survive in such isolation. He sat down on a nearby log, giving her space but remaining close enough to be protective. They didn't speak much. Words seemed unnecessary. The silence was comfortable, a shared understanding that some things could not be explained, only experienced. She pulled out her water bottle and took a cautious sip, her hands trembling slightly from cold and exhaustion. He watched her, but did not comment, only ensuring she was safe. It struck her then how much of this journey depended on him. She had thought herself strong and independent, but in the mountains, survival demanded something more: trust, humility, and willingness to follow someone who knew better. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor, she realized she had no choice but to follow him. It was not surrender, it was acceptance. The wilderness was powerful and unpredictable, and in this giant of a man she had found a guide, protector, and teacher. She did not know what lay ahead, But for the first time in hours, maybe even days, she felt a spark of hope. The giant mountain man stood, stretching slightly, and looked toward the narrowing path ahead. Without a word, he began walking again, and she rose to follow. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Every step forward was a lesson in courage, every breath a reminder that she was alive, and that sometimes the hardest path led to the most remarkable discoveries. And so, step by step, through rain and shadow, fear and wonder, she walked behind him, learning that survival was not just about strength, but about trust, guidance, and the courage to follow when there seemed to be no other choice. The mountains were vast, wild, and unforgiving, but with him she would face them, one step at a time. The woman followed the giant mountain man as the trail twisted deeper into the forest. The air had grown colder after the afternoon rain, and the mist hung low between the trees, turning the forest into a quiet, almost magical place. Each step she took was careful, testing the ground ahead. Slippery rocks, tangled roots, and uneven soil made walking treacherous. Yet he moved with a certainty that made her both anxious and amazed. Every movement seemed effortless, as if he were part of the mountains themselves. She tried to match his pace, but it was difficult. Her legs ached from the long hike, and her fingers were stiff from the cold. She realized quickly that survival in the mountains was not just about endurance. It was about paying attention, being aware of every small detail. He would occasionally glance back at her, and she would meet his eyes. There was no scolding in his gaze, only an expectation that she would try, that she would pay attention. After a while, he stopped near a large boulder beside the trail. He knelt and studied the ground carefully, brushing away leaves with his hand. She approached cautiously, curious about what he had noticed. He pointed to a small line of footprints, partially hidden by the damp soil. "See these," he said quietly. "Not all creatures in the forest are friendly. You need to know the signs or you could be in danger." She leaned closer, examining the tracks. They were small, quick, and uneven. She had never thought much about wildlife outside of pictures and books. The realization that real animals, some dangerous, roamed freely here made her shiver. She felt a small surge of fear, but it was tempered by admiration for him. He seemed to understand the forest in a way that went far beyond knowledge. He belonged to it. As they continued, he began to teach her how to move carefully, how to watch the ground, the trees, the sky. "The forest talks," he explained. "Every sound, every shadow, every smell tells a story. You just have to listen." At first, she struggled to follow. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind distracted by fear and fatigue. But slowly she began to notice subtle changes. The rustle of leaves that might signal a small animal, the broken branch indicating someone, or something, had passed by recently, the soft call of birds warning of nearby danger. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional instructions from him. "Move slowly here," he said at one point, gesturing to a narrow ledge. "Don't look down too long, keep your balance. Step where I step." She did as he said, holding her breath as her foot found the uneven rock. Every nerve in her body was alert, her heart pounding, but she felt herself learning. She was growing stronger, more aware, more capable, yet always aware that she was following his lead. As the day wore on, the forest became darker, the canopy thickening so that little light reached the ground. Rain had stopped, but the mist made everything damp and cold. She shivered, wishing she had worn warmer clothing. He noticed immediately and stopped beside a small overhang of rock that could serve as temporary shelter. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, voice calm. "You need your strength." She sank to the ground, exhausted, and watched him gather small branches and dry leaves. He worked quickly, efficiently, making a modest fire despite the wet conditions. Sparks caught, and a small flame grew into a warm glow. She had never felt such relief at seeing fire. It wasn't just warmth, it was safety, a symbol of control in the wild, a reminder that they could survive here together. As the fire crackled, he handed her a piece of dried meat and a small container of water. She ate slowly, savoring the taste, grateful for the sustenance. He watched her, quiet and vigilant, making sure she was comfortable without imposing. She realized that his strength was not just physical. It was calm, steady, reliable, a quiet power that reassured her in a way words could not. Night fell quickly in the mountains. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the darkness deep and absolute. She wrapped herself in her jacket, sitting close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, but far enough to move if needed. He remained slightly apart, scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes. She could feel his awareness, like a protective shield surrounding her, and it both frightened and comforted her. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we must move carefully. The path will become steeper. There are cliffs ahead and the trail is not forgiving. You need to stay focused." She nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and dread. She wanted to explore, to see the beauty of the mountains, but she understood that survival required caution, obedience, and trust. The night was long. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, branches snapping, distant calls of animals, the whisper of wind through the trees. At first she felt fear creep in, but then she remembered his lessons. Observe, listen, understand. She noticed the small details, the direction of the wind, the placement of rocks near the stream, the calls that indicated a nearby deer rather than a predator. Slowly, fear turned into curiosity and respect. By dawn, she was more alert, more ready for the challenges ahead. The man had already packed a small bag with essentials and was preparing to move. "Eat first," he said. "You'll need energy." She obeyed, realizing that this obedience was not about losing freedom. It was about learning, surviving, and growing stronger. She began to see the wisdom in following his lead, in trusting his knowledge of the wilderness. They moved again, the trail becoming steeper and narrower. Mist swirled around them, hiding dangerous drops and sharp rocks. She followed his every step, mimicking his movements, listening to his instructions. Occasionally, he would extend a hand to help her over a particularly difficult patch, and each time she felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. She realized that relying on someone else was not weakness. It was smart, necessary, and sometimes life-saving. As they climbed, he began to teach her more practical survival skills. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to find fresh water, how to make simple traps to catch small animals for food. She watched carefully, asking questions when necessary, but mostly listening. Every lesson felt important, not just for survival, but for understanding the mountains, their rhythm, and their rules. By midday, they reached a small plateau overlooking a narrow valley below. The view was breathtaking, layers of mountains stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of green and gold. She stopped, taking a deep breath, letting the beauty of the scene fill her senses. He stood beside her, silent, watching her reaction. "You see," he said after a moment, "if you respect the land, it will teach you. If you ignore it, it will punish you." She nodded, realizing the truth in his words. The mountains were not merely a place to hike. They were a teacher, a challenge, and a reminder of how small and fragile humans were in the grand scheme of nature. The day continued with lessons in navigation. He taught her how to read the clouds, the sun, and the stars to determine direction. He showed her how to recognize subtle changes in the terrain that indicated safe paths versus dangerous ones. Each moment was a test, and each test required her full attention and cooperation. She was learning to rely on him, not blindly but wisely. As the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they found another small clearing to rest. He had taught her to always look for safe spots before nightfall, places where shelter, water, and food were accessible. She marveled at his foresight, his knowledge that seemed to anticipate every challenge before it arrived. That night, as they huddled near the fire again, she thought about her life before the mountains. She had considered herself independent, capable, fearless. But now she understood the difference between independence and survival. She had learned that true strength came not just from physical ability or willpower, but from knowing when to follow, when to trust, and when to let experience guide her. The giant mountain man sat quietly beside her, his eyes scanning the dark forest. She felt safe, not because he promised protection, but because he had proven it through knowledge, skill, and consistency. She realized that following his lead was not a loss of freedom. It was a chance to survive, to grow, and to learn from someone who had mastered the wilderness in a way few could. As she drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of the forest surrounding her, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion, relief, and wonder. She knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, steeper trails, colder winds, and possibly dangerous encounters, but she also knew she was ready. She would follow his lead, as she had no choice, and in doing so she was learning to navigate not just the mountains, but a new understanding of courage, trust, and resilience. The morning light seeped through the trees, creating long streaks of gold across the forest floor. The woman woke to the faint smell of damp earth and pine, her body sore from the previous day's long hike. The giant mountain man was already awake, crouched beside the small fire they had kept smoldering overnight. He was preparing a simple breakfast of foraged berries, nuts, and some dried meat. His movements were calm, precise, and efficient. Watching him, she felt a strange sense of comfort. He had become not just a guide, but a presence she could depend on. "Eat quickly," he said, his voice low but firm. "The trail ahead will be difficult." She nodded and ate, the cool morning air making her appetite smaller than usual, but she knew she needed energy. Every lesson she had learned so far reminded her that fatigue could be dangerous in the mountains. Once they were ready, he motioned for her to follow. The path became steeper almost immediately. Jagged rocks and loose soil made footing tricky. He moved first, testing each step before committing his full weight, and she mirrored him carefully, trusting his judgment. Every step required concentration. A single misstep could lead to a fall or worse, an accident too serious to manage alone. As they climbed, he began to explain more about the mountains, not just survival but the land itself. "These mountains have been here long before humans," he said, glancing at her without turning fully. "They teach respect. They teach patience. You can't rush them. You can't ignore them. If you do, they will remind you of your place." She listened intently, feeling the truth in his words. She had always thought of nature as something beautiful, perhaps even gentle, but now she understood its power and unpredictability. The mountains were alive in a way she had never imagined, and he was their interpreter, teaching her to read every subtle sign. Hours passed, and the trail grew more challenging. Rocks became larger, trees scarcer, and the air thinner. Every breath required effort, and every movement tested her balance. Yet she found herself relying less on fear and more on instinct, guided by the knowledge he had imparted. She began to notice the patterns he used, the careful placement of his feet, the way he tested branches before stepping on them, the attention he paid to the wind and the sky. At one point, the path narrowed along a cliffside. The drop on her left was dizzying, and she felt her stomach lurch. Her hands gripped the rock wall instinctively, and she glanced at him for guidance. He moved with unshakable confidence, taking slow, steady steps. "Keep your weight over your feet," he instructed quietly. "Don't look down too long. Focus on the path, not the fall." She followed his advice, her heart pounding, but gradually she began to feel less afraid. She realized that following his lead wasn't just about survival. It was about learning to trust, about discovering her own strength through guidance. For the first time, she saw him not just as a giant protector, but as a teacher shaping her abilities and awareness. By midday, they reached a small stream where water trickled over smooth stones. He gestured for her to drink and refill her container. She knelt beside the water, letting the cold stream run over her hands. He watched her silently, vigilant, ensuring no danger approached. She noticed with quiet gratitude how effortlessly he balanced strength and attentiveness. Every action was purposeful but not overbearing. As they rested, he shared more about the skills she needed to survive. He taught her how to spot animal tracks, how to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, and how to use natural landmarks for navigation. She asked questions, eager to understand, and he answered without impatience, his calm demeanor making it easier to absorb the knowledge. With each lesson, she felt herself becoming more capable, more aware, more attuned to the wilderness around her. Their journey continued, the trail twisting and climbing higher. The air grew thinner, colder, and the sky overhead darkened with the approach of clouds. Soon, rain began to fall in small, cold drops. They found shelter under a dense overhang of rocks, just enough to keep them dry. The sound of raindrops hitting the stones was steady and soothing, a rhythm to which they both seemed to attune. As she sat close to the fire, she reflected on how much she had already learned. Just 2 days ago, she had been confident in her independence, thinking herself capable of facing any challenge. Now she realized that true independence was not about refusing help. It was about knowing when to accept guidance, when to trust experience, and when to follow someone wiser. That night, as the rain continued, the giant mountain man shared fragments of his story. He spoke sparingly, revealing only what was necessary. He had grown up in the mountains, learning from his father, and had spent years alone after a tragedy had taken his family. His words were not bitter, but filled with the quiet acceptance of someone who understood hardship and resilience. She listened, captivated by the depth of his experience, understanding that every lesson he taught was born from a lifetime of living with the land. She felt an unexpected bond forming. It was not romantic, at least not yet, but it was deeper than simple trust. It was an understanding forged through shared challenge, survival, and respect. She realized that she was beginning to rely on him, not just for protection, but for guidance, for insight, and for the reassurance that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The next day brought new challenges. The trail led to a narrow ridge, exposed to the wind and cold. She shivered, wrapping her jacket tighter around her, and he adjusted his pace to match hers, silently ensuring she kept up. Every step required concentration, every movement was deliberate. She noticed how he read the wind and terrain, predicting danger before it arrived, and she tried to learn from his intuition. At one point, they encountered a small herd of deer grazing in a clearing. He stopped and gestured for her to observe quietly. "Notice their behavior," he whispered. "How they move, how they react. The forest speaks through them. Learn to listen." She watched, fascinated, as the deer shifted nervously, ears twitching, eyes alert. She began to understand that survival was not just about fighting challenges. It was about observing, understanding, and respecting the natural order. The woman began to see a change within herself. Her confidence was growing, not the reckless pride she had before, but a calm, measured assurance. She was stronger, more aware, and more capable, yet she understood that this strength depended on her ability to follow his lead. The lessons of the mountains were becoming part of her, shaping her not just for survival, but for life. As they descended into a small valley later that afternoon, the clouds parted slightly, allowing sunlight to filter through. The scene was breathtaking. Golden light spilled across the trees, highlighting the texture of the mountains and the delicate beauty of the wilderness. She paused, taking it all in, feeling a sense of awe and humility. He watched her silent, giving her the space to absorb the moment, and she felt a strange warmth, a connection not just to him, but to the land itself. That evening they made camp near a gentle stream. He taught her how to build a small, efficient fire, how to shelter themselves from the cold, and how to prepare a simple meal with what they had. She followed his instructions carefully, noticing how every motion had a purpose, every action a lesson. She realized that she had begun to anticipate his instructions, that his guidance had become second nature. Night fell, and the stars emerged in a clear sky. They sat quietly by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. For the first time, she felt a profound sense of belonging, not just to the mountains but to the rhythm of life within them. She had come seeking adventure, and she had found much more: knowledge, resilience, and a bond built on trust. As she lay down to rest, she reflected on how far she had come. She had faced fear, learned new skills, and begun to understand the mountains in a way that few outsiders ever could. And through it all, he had been there, guiding, teaching, protecting, and challenging her. She realized that survival was not just a physical task, but a mental and emotional journey, one that required trust, patience, and humility. And so she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, ready for whatever challenges the mountains would bring tomorrow, confident that by following his lead, she could face them all. The morning air was sharp and cold as the woman awoke to the faint rustle of leaves. Mist clung to the trees like a thin veil, and the trail ahead was barely visible through the low fog. She stretched her aching muscles, still sore from yesterday's climb, and looked over at the giant mountain man. He was already awake, checking the surroundings with a careful, watchful gaze. His presence was reassuring, but also a reminder that the mountains were not forgiving. She had learned that much. "Today will be difficult," he said, his voice low, steady. There was no question in it, no room for argument. She nodded, knowing he spoke from experience. Every challenge so far had proven him right. Survival depended on trust, patience, and following his lead without hesitation. They began the ascent into steeper terrain. The trail was narrow and treacherous, the path covered in loose gravel and jagged rocks. Each step required concentration, and she found herself moving more cautiously than ever before. He led the way, testing each footfall, and she mirrored him, matching his movements as best she could. Every slip, every misstep reminded her how fragile a human body could be in such wild, unforgiving conditions. Halfway up a particularly steep ridge, the wind picked up. Cold gusts whipped through the valley, rattling the trees and sending her hood flying back from her head. She hugged her jacket tighter, shivering, and he slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "Hold onto the rope," he instructed, producing a thin but sturdy cord. She tied it around her waist, the other end securely fastened to him. The small gesture made her heart pound. It was a literal lifeline. Step by careful step, they climbed, her body straining against gravity and exhaustion. He occasionally extended a hand, helping her over jagged rocks or guiding her around unstable ground. She felt a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Pride had been a part of her identity before this journey, but now she understood that humility was as important as strength. In the mountains, arrogance could be fatal. By late morning, dark clouds rolled over the peaks, bringing sudden, heavy rain. The narrow trail became slick, water running in small rivulets that threatened to pull her boots from the rocks. Visibility dropped, and the forest grew eerily quiet except for the sound of raindrops and the occasional distant crack of thunder. She clung to the rope, keeping her focus on him, moving exactly as he instructed. The fear she felt was sharp, but she also felt trust growing deeper within her. At one point, a sudden splash of water dislodged a small rock under her foot. She stumbled, heart racing, but he caught her arm with firm, steady hands. "Stay calm," he said. "Panic will make this worse." She swallowed hard and nodded, feeling the truth of his words. His calmness gave her strength, but she also realized that her own ability to stay focused and deliberate was growing. She was learning not just to follow, but to think and act carefully within the guidance he provided. After what felt like hours of climbing, they reached a small plateau. Water ran off the rocks, soaking their clothes, but they were safe from immediate danger. She collapsed beside a tree, exhausted but alive. He sat quietly next to her, removing a small container of water and handing it to her. She drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. He spoke softly, almost as if the mountains themselves were listening. "You are learning," he said, "not just to survive but to understand. Every step, every choice matters here. One mistake can cost you everything." She nodded, realizing that this was more than a physical journey. It was a test of patience, observation, and trust. Each challenge pushed her limits, teaching her not just to rely on him, but also to rely on her own growing instincts. The day wore on, and the trail became increasingly dangerous. They encountered a narrow ridge with a sheer drop on one side. The wind howled through the mountains, threatening to push her off balance. She froze, her heart pounding, and he reached out, steadying her with a firm hand. "Focus on your footing," he said. "Keep your weight low. One step at a time." She obeyed, placing each foot carefully, feeling the rope between them like a lifeline. Hours passed in tense silence. Every sound, every movement required attention. The mountains were unforgiving, and she understood now that survival was not just about strength or endurance. It was about awareness, discipline, and trust. Her admiration for him deepened as she saw how he anticipated danger, how every action he took was measured and precise. He was not just strong, he was careful, patient, and utterly reliable. As evening approached, they found shelter in a small rocky overhang. He quickly gathered branches and leaves, building a fire to provide warmth and light. She sat close, exhausted, shivering from the cold and wet. He handed her some dried meat and a small container of water, his eyes never leaving the dark forest outside. She ate slowly, grateful for the sustenance, aware that every meal, every drop of water was precious in these mountains. Night fell quickly, and the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, branches snapping, distant calls of animals, the whisper of wind through the trees. Fear tried to creep in, but she remembered his teachings. Observe, understand, act carefully. She noticed subtle signs, a slight rustle in the underbrush, a flash of movement that allowed her to remain calm and ready. She realized that trust was not blind. It was built on knowledge, observation, and shared experience. Later, as the fire crackled, he spoke quietly. "Tomorrow will test you further," he said. "You will need to trust every lesson you have learned. You will need to rely on me, yes, but also on yourself. Survival is never about one person alone. It is about partnership." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She understood now that following his lead was not about giving up control. It was about learning to act wisely within guidance, and about discovering her own strength through trust. The next day brought one of the greatest challenges yet. They reached a steep, rocky slope leading to a narrow ledge high above the valley. The wind tore at them with sudden force, threatening to unbalance her. She gripped the rope tightly, every muscle in her body straining, following his careful instructions. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation could send her tumbling down. She felt fear prick at her mind, but she reminded herself of everything he had taught her: observe, plan, act, and trust. Step by careful step, they crossed the ledge. He guided her, never rushing, always steady, always alert. The rope between them was taut, a constant reminder that she was not alone, that every step required attention and care. When they finally reached solid ground again, her legs trembled, and she sank to the rocks in relief. He knelt beside her, offering water and a reassuring glance. She realized how much she had relied on him, but also how much she had grown, her awareness, her focus, her confidence. By the afternoon, they had reached a dense section of the forest, where fallen trees and tangled roots slowed their progress. Here he taught her another critical lesson: improvisation. "The mountains will not always give you a clear path," he explained. "You must find your own way, using what you have and always remembering the rules of safety." She followed his example, testing each branch, gauging each step, learning to navigate not just with guidance but with her own growing judgment. Evening fell and they made camp once more. She was exhausted beyond words, but also filled with a sense of accomplishment. She had survived extreme terrain, harsh weather, and her own fears. She had learned to trust, to follow, and to think carefully in a world where mistakes could be fatal. She realized that her dependence on him was not weakness, it was wisdom, and it had allowed her to grow stronger than she ever imagined. As the fire flickered in the dark forest, she thought about how much had changed in just a few days. The woman who had entered the mountains thinking herself independent and fearless had learned humility, patience, and the value of guidance. She had learned to observe, to listen, and to act deliberately. And through it all, the giant mountain man had been there, teaching, protecting, and guiding her through every challenge. That night, as she lay beside the fire, she reflected on the lessons of the day. Survival was not just about skill or strength. It was about trust, observation, and courage. She understood that she was stronger than she had thought, but she also knew that strength alone was not enough. The mountains demanded respect, patience, and the willingness to follow when necessary. She had learned to do all of these things, and in doing so had grown in ways she never expected. And as she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, yet she felt ready. She would face them, as always, by following his lead, and in that she found both safety and a new understanding of herself. The morning sun rose slowly, spilling soft golden light across the mountains. The woman stirred awake, muscles sore but her spirit stronger than ever. She had survived storms, treacherous paths, and the raw power of the wilderness. Yet as she opened her eyes, she realized she no longer felt alone in the mountains. The giant mountain man was already awake, moving silently, checking the area around their small camp. His calm presence had become a constant reassurance, a guiding force she now understood she could rely on completely. "Today," he said quietly, "we finish the climb. The peak is ahead, and from there the path will level." "You are ready," she nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and relief. She knew this final stretch would not be easy, but she also knew she had grown in ways she had never imagined. Every lesson, every challenge, every moment of fear had prepared her for this. They began the ascent, the trail steep and unforgiving. The early sunlight highlighted every crack and crevice in the rock, making the climb both beautiful and daunting. She moved carefully, placing each foot deliberately, keeping her weight balanced. The rope he had given her days ago was secure around her waist, a lifeline connecting them, yet she also felt confidence in her own steps. She was no longer just following blindly. She was learning, thinking, and moving with purpose. Hours passed as they climbed higher, the air growing thinner and colder. She breathed steadily, recalling his lessons on pacing, on conserving energy, on observing the environment. Each instruction that had seemed simple before now felt like a lifeline. She realized that every step had taught her patience, courage, and awareness. And every step had deepened the trust she placed in him, not blind trust, but trust earned through his skill, care, and unwavering presence. At one point, they reached a particularly narrow ledge overlooking a deep valley. The drop was dizzying and her legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. She glanced at him, expecting reassurance, and he met her gaze with calm, steady eyes. "Focus," he said simply. "One step at a time. You can do this." His words carried a quiet authority that left no room for hesitation. She exhaled slowly and followed his lead, placing each foot carefully, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The wind whipped fiercely, and a sudden gust threatened to throw her off balance. She tightened her grip on the rope and adjusted her stance. He moved alongside her, guiding her subtly but allowing her to make her own choices. She realized that this was the essence of their journey. He was not controlling her, but teaching her to control herself within the mountain's challenges. Step by step, breath by breath, She reached solid ground on the other side of the ledge, her pulse finally slowing. The path began to level slightly, and they entered a serene section of the forest bathed in sunlight. Birds sang, and the scent of pine filled the air. She stopped for a moment, breathing deeply, and looked around. The mountains no longer seemed threatening, at least not in the same way. They were alive, yes, powerful and unpredictable, but she had learned to move with them, to respect them, and to survive alongside them. She realized that her fear had been replaced with understanding, awe, and a quiet joy. They came to a small stream where the water sparkled in the sunlight. He gestured for her to kneel and drink. As she bent over the cool water, she marveled at how far she had come. Just a few days ago, she had been confident but naive, unprepared for the true challenges of the wilderness. Now she was alert, capable, and aware of her surroundings. She had learned to trust, to follow guidance, and to rely on her own growing instincts. He watched her quietly, never speaking unnecessarily, yet she felt his pride and approval in the way he observed her. She realized that the trust they had built was mutual. He had guided her, protected her, and taught her, but he had also relied on her focus, her attention, and her willingness to learn. She felt a deep respect for him, not just for his strength, but for his patience, wisdom, and integrity. As the afternoon sun began to sink, they reached the base of the final peak. The climb was steep and rocky, requiring all the skills she had learned over the past days. She paused at the base, feeling the weight of exhaustion and the height of the challenge. He came beside her, steady and calm. "Remember everything," he said softly. "Every step, every observation, every choice. You know this." She nodded, feeling the power of his words. She realized that she did know this, she had learned, she had survived, and she had grown. Step by step, she began the ascent, following his careful guidance, her movements deliberate and precise. The rope tied to her waist was still there, but she felt stronger, more capable, more confident in her own abilities. The climb was grueling. Rocks shifted beneath her feet, and loose soil threatened to send her sliding backward. The wind tore at her clothes, making it difficult to maintain balance. Yet she pressed on, relying on the lessons she had absorbed and the guidance he provided. Every time fear threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself of how far she had come and how much she had learned. Hours later, they reached the top. The view was breathtaking. Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, valleys and peaks bathed in golden sunlight. She gasped, overwhelmed by the beauty and vastness of it all. The sense of triumph was intoxicating, not just because they had reached the peak, but because she had done so with skill, patience, and trust. She looked at him, and for the first time they shared a small, genuine smile. He did not speak immediately, simply observing the horizon. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, a profound understanding of what they had achieved together. This was more than a physical journey. It was a journey of growth, trust, and resilience. She had followed his lead when she had no choice, yet through it, she had discovered her own strength and courage. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the mountains, they began their descent. The trail was easier now, yet still required caution. She moved carefully, her confidence evident but tempered with awareness. She realized that survival was not just about reaching a destination. It was about the journey, the lessons learned, and the trust formed along the way. They stopped at a small clearing for the night. She sat beside the fire, reflecting on the journey. The woman she had been at the start, the independent, fearless, and naive woman, was no longer the same. She had learned humility, patience, and the value of guidance. She had learned to observe, think, and act deliberately. And she had learned that trusting someone wise could reveal strengths she never knew she had. The giant mountain man sat nearby, tending the fire, silent as always. She realized then that he had not just guided her through the mountains, he had guided her to herself. Every lesson, every instruction, every challenge had been a step toward understanding her own capabilities and limits. And through it all, he had been patient, steady, and unwavering, allowing her to learn and grow without ever forcing her beyond what she could handle. As night fell and the stars emerged, they sat quietly, watching the forest around them. The woman felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for his guidance but for the journey itself. She had survived the mountains, yes, but she had also learned about trust, resilience, and human connection. She understood that sometimes, when faced with the unknown, the best choice was to follow someone who knew the way, and in doing so, to discover one's own strength. By morning, they began their final walk down the trail toward the lower valleys. The sun rose over the peaks, illuminating the path with a warm glow. She moved steadily, no longer afraid, her confidence and awareness guiding her steps. The mountains no longer seemed threatening. They were a part of her journey, a teacher and a test she had passed. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, where the mountains gave way to rolling hills and familiar trails, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said simply. Her voice carried emotion she could not fully express. He nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without words, and together, they walked toward the path that would lead her home. She realized that she would carry the lessons of the mountains with her forever. The value of trust, the strength in humility, and the courage to follow when necessary. The giant mountain man had guided her through danger and uncertainty, but he had also guided her to a deeper understanding of herself. And as she walked down the trail, feeling the sun on her face and the wind at her back, she knew she was changed, stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever life might bring, carrying the spirit of the mountains within her. By the time they reached the small town at the base of the mountains, the woman had transformed. People who had known her before might not have recognized her, not because she had changed physically, but because she moved with quiet confidence, awareness, and strength that came from experience, not arrogance. She had faced fear, relied on guidance, and discovered her own courage in the most challenging of places. And as she said her final farewell to the giant mountain man, she understood the truth of his words from the first day. Sometimes, when survival depends on following someone else's lead, it is not surrender. It is the path to growth, understanding, and inner strength. She would never forget the mountains, the lessons, or the man who had taught her to survive, to trust, and to believe in herself. As she turned toward the town, ready to return to her life, she carried with her the knowledge that courage is not always loud, that strength is not always physical, and that trust, when given wisely, can reveal the deepest reserves of resilience within the human spirit.